The South Hill, Virginia crater incident. So South Hill was a small tobacco town of about 3,000 people in Mecklenburg County, Virginia. It's located just north of the North Carolina border. I'm just going to give you a little map details here to keep in mind real quick before I go over this. This is an aerial image that contains a modern satellite image of the area, and I overlaid it with a 1967 aerial image. That red dot is where this object landed, and the burn marks are. That square box is where this warehouse that I'll be telling you guys about is. And this is just a kind of a drawn map. Again, you see the warehouse down there on the bottom right, and these wheat fields and these various streets and where the burn mark occurred. But let's get over the description here. So it's about 5 minutes before 9 p.m., and it's April 21st, 1967. Clifton N. Crowder, manager of the Mobile Chemical Company warehouse in South Hill, Virginia, has been alone at the office for the last few hours going over the plant's books. He decides to call it a night and heads to his car to drive home. Again, there's the warehouse and this little road here. As he starts home, he heads up the warehouse's red clay driveway until it intersects with East Farrell Street. East Farrell Street is a paved road that heads into town to the west. As he barely starts down this road, he's only about 50 to 75 yards down the road when his headlights fall upon an object about 400 feet away, blocking his path. This object he describes as dull aluminum, shaped like a storage tank, about 12 feet in diameter. It's about 15 to 16 feet high, and he says it kind of looks like the nitrogen tank near the fertilizer warehouse he works at. It rests on a set of legs about 3 to 3.5 feet long. Hoping to get a better view at the object, he gets within about 200 feet of it and he switches on his bright lights. Now, in this image here, you kind of see that tree line. Again, this is a modern day image. At that time where that tree line starts, that used to be the road, and that was the first kind of dirt road on his map. And that's basically where he stopped his car, was where that dirt road intersects, and there was a mailbox there, about 200 feet away from the object. Now, he only gets about a good look at the object for about 5 seconds when suddenly a white burst of flame came from the bottom of the object that he described as being like 1,000 flashbulbs going off in your face at once. There was no sound at all. During this burst of white flame, the object shot straight into the air like a bullet, or like just a snap of your fingers. He says he did not actually see the object take off in flight. It just sort of vanished and disappeared in a flash. Now, at about this time, he sees car headlights approaching from the opposite direction that he thinks turns down one of the dirt roads that you can see further down that picture. Meanwhile, where this incident occurred, he says the road is on fire. It burns for roughly 15 to 20 seconds, and it was only about that long. Some reports are a bit inaccurate. A valet's book mentioned the burning lasted for 15 minutes. I don't know if that's a simple typo or what. Valet doesn't tend to get details very often. But it was only about 15 to 20 seconds that it burned. And when it started to burn around, after it dies out, he decides to drive around the object and head straight to South Hill so he can contact the police station. Now, he arrives at the police station at about 9:05 p.m. So this is only a few short minutes after this whole incident happened. And he ends up talking to these two police officers that he tells his story to. He's known these officers for many years. I believe their names was Murphy and Crawford. And he quickly tells them his story. These officers trust him not to tell wild stories because he's a prominent businessman and a member of the community. He's the treasurer of his local South Methodist church. He is also involved in many other local civic organizations. In fact, the Crowder name is kind of pretty big around South Hill to this day. I was just looking at town hall meetings from last year, and it's just full of the Crowder name. And so he's a pretty prominent name in the community, and people trust him. And so the officers decide to go back with him and check out this site. So they returned to the site, and when they arrived, they were met there by two other sheriff deputies. Now, these police were actually the state police, right? They were the Virginia State Police. And he was met by two local sheriff deputies who had heard of the incident over the radio. Now, these four people go over the scene with the headlights from the police cars and some handheld flashlights that they have. Now, there is another person present. You might wonder who took these photos of the officers. I mean, how did these get in the paper? Well, it's because there was a newspaper man that actually went with Crowder and the police officers back, minutes later to investigate the scene. So they're there investigating this scene with their flashlights, and they find this kidney-shaped black spot on the road about 3 feet at its widest point. Something had ignited the tar in the macadamized road, leaving this burn spot. And it's still hot when the two officers arrive and investigate the scene. After they investigate for a while, it's getting late, and they decide to kind of call it a night. After Crowder left, two of the officers actually ended up finding these 4 singed paper matches kind of in the center of the burn spot. And Crowder, at that point, that night, didn't know about the matches they had found yet. Now, Saturday morning, Crowder is heading back into work again. This guy's kind of like me, it seems. He's a bit of a workaholic. He's working 7 days a week, every morning. And so he's heading back to work again, 7 in the morning. And he decides to stop at this guy, Norman Martin's house, who Norman Martin is a farmer. And he lives where that red box is, across from a wheat field there. And he wants to see if Martin had seen anything the night before. So he goes to visit him, and there's some conflicting testimony here between Crowder and Martin. Crowder basically asked him if he saw anything last night and unusual, and Martin says no, not really. And so then Crowder proceeded to tell him what happened, and this is where the conflict is. Crowder claims he never told Martin his story first. Martin says that's not true. He told me his story, and then Martin said, well, now that you mention it, I did actually see something. And so after he related the story, Martin told Crowder that he had been visiting a relative with his wife at the hospital in town on Friday evening, and they had returned home at about 8:45 to 9 p.m., which is roughly the time of Crowder's sighting. When his wife went inside, he stood in the driveway for a moment to kind of just take in the view of his this guy and his farm and fields and whatnot. And he's kind of looking up across his wheat field there, north of his wheat field. And he sees this bright light illuminate this large oak tree near the road and another large pine further back from the road. He said the light was extremely bright, and then it seemed to travel up the tree until it eventually kind of went out. He said the light was so bright that he could see a bird, or he could shoot a bird out of the tree. But he also said it looked fairly similar to when cars come out of the driveway of one of the other houses and shine their headlights upon the light. And so at that time, Martin that night didn't think anything that unusual about it. He didn't think it was mysterious or anomalous, and wasn't even going to say or think anything about it. But Crowder got him to tell a story. At this point, the story starts to hit the nationwide press, and this is a case where it's, again, very quick because that reporter was there. This story got out, and by Saturday, the next morning, this paper was around the country. It was in a paper just north of me in Centralia, Washington. The papers in California, papers in Virginia. So it got pretty major nationwide coverage, and several hundred, if not thousands, of people started to show up over on Saturday and Sunday to kind of investigate and see the site for themselves. Meanwhile, the local police and county law enforcement are continuing to do their on-site investigation, and they make a startling discovery that they didn't notice the night before. They discover these impressions in the tarmac where the legs of this object would have been. They are similar to impressions made by football cleats. The problem is officers swear they could not have missed them the night before. So they didn't notice these impressions on Friday night, right after the event happened. They only found them again Saturday morning. And we don't know 100% who actually found them. They could not, people just seem to know they were there couple, Philip Class, tried to find out who found this impressions, and they could not find actually who was the first person to even find the impressions. But what we do know is that when they looked Friday night, nobody saw them. When they looked Saturday, they found these 4 impressions there. So it's possible that they missed them the night before, only doing the search with their 2 headlights of the cars and their handheld flashlights. But the officers dispute that, saying it would be impossible. They said they actually inspected the ground, inches from the ground, with their flashlights by hand, and they would have seen them. And they did find those small matches. So anyways, they find these impressions there this next day. And these impressions, like I said, they look kind of like a cleat, like you might expect on a football cleat there. Now, at this point, Northwestern University professor and Air Force consultant Jalen Hynek calls Crowder around 5 to 6 p.m. on Saturday to get a statement and to inform Crowder that he would be sending his top assistant, William T. Powers, to investigate the case, and that he would be arriving the following morning, Sunday, at 9 a.m. NICAP had actually got the call earlier, around 1:30 p.m. from a local reporter. By 2:30 p.m., they had already dispatched 3 investigators from Washington, D.C. They sent out Gordon Lohr, Don Berliner, and Leon Katchen, who was a physicist at NASA Goddard Space Research Center. After stopping to get the full scoop from the reporter that had tipped them off, they arrived at the Crowder's house at around 7 p.m. They ended up interviewing Crowder for about an hour before heading out to the site to take some photos. Now it's late again, so Crowder doesn't stay very long, and he ends up going back home. So they end up heading off back to the police station that Crowder reported to, so they could end up talking to the officers. Now, while they're there, they learn of several more sightings that had taken place in Richmond that Saturday night. Local police officers in South Hell even had their own sighting at about 9:45 p.m. A group of CB radio enthusiasts would also have sightings that night and would chase the lights around in the car. And then they would provide a running commentary of the sightings over the radios. All in total, at least 19 residents in town would end up seeing yellowish looking lights that kind of bobbed up and down that night. Now at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, William T. Powers arrives on the scene in order to investigate. Now, NICAP also returns to the scene. After investigating the CB sighting, they returned to their hotel room at about 2 a.m. and then they showed back up at about the same time as Powers, 9 a.m. to start their investigation again. Powers ends up taking measurements of the burn area and landing marks. Where the machine rested, he finds these spike holes that are about 6 inches apart, 7/8 inch in diameter, and about 1 inch deep. There are 4 feet, and these feet are roughly about 11.5 to 12 feet apart, and the diagonals are about 16.5 and 1 inches and 16.5 and 6 inches. So it's not a perfect square. Powers concludes that the center of gravity is roughly where the fire point is, and notes that the intersection of the diagonals deviates roughly 2 degrees from 90. And this is actually important when it comes to loading, for like a rocket or a craft. And if this craft did have these 4 legs, it was designed pretty badly that it put too much weight on one side. So it wasn't particularly meant for that road or for landing there anyways. So NICAP would find the farmer Norman Martin later that day, and they interviewed him before they headed back to DC in the early afternoon. Gordon Lohr and Don Berliner would end up returning on Tuesday to continue their investigation. Powers sticks around until Monday and does experiments to try and recreate the physical effects. Using kerosene, gasoline, and a blowtorch, she attempts to simulate the black spot, but has little luck. He has various issues, like it releases black smoke instead of the kind of white smoke or flames that he reported. The duration of the burn was off. He had trouble igniting the fuel. And it's important to note that you do need fuel. Tarmac roads don't burn. They won't burn without an external fuel source. You can't just light them on fire and they will continue to burn. They'll only burn as long as the fuel source is present. So this object did burn the road is because it dumped fuel and lit that on fire, not because of the flame of the object. Otherwise, it wouldn't have maintained burning like that. And they consulted with the National Asphalt Institute, or that's not the real name. It's something like that. And the big asphalt conglomerate institute of all the companies on this issue. So they tried to recreate that, and the effects they weren't quite exactly the same. The effects on the tarmac ended up being different as well. The effects of the rock in the tarmac ended up being different. He had a little bit better of effects, a luck in creating these impressions in the road using a jury-rigged impact tester that he created. And again, they had found those matches that I mentioned, and they weren't exactly able to simulate recreating the burning of the matches as well. But finding those matches implies something was burnt and ignited, and that they, it was part of the actual fire. Crowder would dismiss the matches and try and pass them off as that it was just lots of people came to the site smoking cigarettes. Maybe the police dropped the matches there after they lit up a cigarette. Only the problem is the police say that's impossible. They were the first ones there, and they found them then, before anyone else showed up to the scene. And that lighting a match to light a cigarette would not burn these matches in the way they were burned. These matches were not just lit and then disposed of. They were part of a fire and singed all the way through. So that's kind of the issue of the matches there. So what are we kind of to think about this case? Crowder, again, he's considered a good member of the community. He's well respected. The police had known him for years and found him completely trustworthy and said he would not lie. We know how that goes, but the general conclusion seems to be that he saw something and was not involved personally with the hoax. William T. Powers would say in his report, as to this writing, therefore, in the absence of any additional clues or the results of chemical analysis, the only conclusion that can be drawn is that the witness probably did see something out of the ordinary, but that we cannot rule out the possibility that a hoax was perpetrated by some person or persons other than the principal witness. A possible hoax is involved, but evidence for it is not clear. And we don't actually get any the results of the tests they took, and they took core samples of the road. They took other samples of the road, and these results were taken to NASA. These samples were taken to NASA Goddard and looked at, and then split up and analyzed a couple other places. And there was nothing kind of remarkable about these road samples to kind of add anything to the case, which always turns out to be the case. It's just pretty normal burn marks. So Blue Book would end up carrying the case as an unidentified while acknowledging that it still could be a hoax. So we are left with an interesting but a mostly single witness sighting with perhaps some corroboration from the farmer Norman Martin, but he never saw an object. He only saw a bright light that seemed to illuminate a tree that he didn't seem to find very mysterious, and said looked much like when car headlights would illuminate the tree. But we have an incident that did leave real physical effects on the road. The burn mark was still warm when they returned with the police minutes later. Impressions were found where the legs would have been. But those impressions were not found until the following day and were either missed the night before or they were added later. If they were not there the night before and they were added Saturday morning, that would sort of imply it certainly was a hoax. But they missed them. Still a bit open. There's also, the matter of the found matches and that were in the center and that seemed to ignite something. The mark on the road is not the kind of mark you would get from some sort of rocket blast. It's the kind of mark you would get from somebody free spilling fuel and igniting it. And the fact that we find those matches is pretty damning. In fact, it was so damning to the police officers that they were pretty much convinced it was a hoax that night, despite continuing to support him in the papers. In fact, the reporter that was there that took the photos after they found the matches was so convinced that it was probably garbage that he wasn't even going to turn in his photos or turn in a story. It was only after talking to the police officer that they felt that Crowder was such a respected man, and he saw them taking the photos, that he would be mad if he didn't see the photos turn up in the newspaper. So they decided to send the story in. However, the newspaper does not mention finding the matches. It does not mention other details of the story that get left out and then repeated in the Associated Press around the country and the world. But if it is a hoax, and again, this is something that Phil Klass points out in his report, and it's something other people like Charlie Weiser points out in a lot of these cases, is the complete incuriosity of the witness in trying to figure out what's going on. Not only was Crowder not interested in these matches, he showed little to no interest in the landing marks being found as well. In fact, when they were reported, he was meeting with one of the officers in his office there, only about 1,000 feet away from the scene, and he didn't even leave with the officer to go check them out. In fact, he wouldn't even stop to check them out until he went to lunch later in the day. On that Saturday morning, after he talked to Martin, he didn't even bother to stop at the site to look at it again. You'd think if you had an encounter so amazing like that, you would bother to at least stop and check it out again. But he seemed to have no interest in really looking into any of it at that point, which is kind of weird. But if it is a hoax, who pulled it off and why, right? In such a rural part of the country, like what's the point? Few of any people would end up seeing this hoax. And how did they pull it off? While the preliminary experiments they did to recreate the marks were not completely successful, it is possible with further experiments that they could have recreated these marks using different fuels. Sometime later, in fact, they would find the word PV67 hoax found painted on the side of the road near the burn spot. PV in this case stands for Parkview High School. It's a local high school. And Crowder himself has a teenage daughter that attended. He, however, rejects the idea that it was a high school hoax because it would be far too complicated for a group of high school students to pull off. I personally don't buy that it's too complicated for high schools to pull off argument. But that was his personal belief there. Or maybe Crowder did encounter a vehicle from somewhere else that Friday evening on that rural Virginia road. It should be noted, though, that he never actually thought it was a vehicle from outer space. He believed that it was a secret government craft of some kind. Why one would be landing in the tobacco country would be anyone's guess. He eventually told Phil Klass that he thought it was a gas-filled bag that would explode, so that was set to explode when the car headlights hit it, and that it was some sort of psychological experiment being performed on him by the military. Why the military would be performing such an experiment on a chemical company fertilizer warehouse manager, again, I'm not entirely sure. He, like I say, he was not really a believer of the whole UFO thing. I found a Facebook post by a Jeff Crowder who said Cliff was actually his great uncle, and he retold this story his entire life, and said the townspeople mocked him over it. Again, I'm not sure why, because he didn't actually attribute anything super strange to it. He actually first thought it was a government craft of some kind, and then he thought it was a gas bag that incinerated. That's not really anything to ridicule anyone over, in my opinion. There was actually around the same time period, the same day, in fact, in Afraid of Washington, a case that happened. It was not technically the same night, because this case in Virginia happened at 9 p.m. This one happened at 1:30 in the morning. But it was another case of where they were driving on a road and they had to abruptly slam on the brakes because of this bright object. And they described it basically taking off, vanishing in a blinding light. It's not exactly the same because they see the object later and they say it kind of ends up following the car. But this happened on the same day. In fact, there was a whole kind of rash of sightings that would take off because of this encounter. After Crowder had his sighting, everyone in the region started getting out the binoculars looking for UFOs. And it wasn't a month later where there was another case, and I don't know if it's a copycat or not, but on June 22nd, about 20 minutes north of South Hill in Lunenburg County, there was a case where they found these more imprint marks on the road that they described as being more like horse footprints, or like horseshoes, basically, of some kind, that left these marks, imprints in the road there. So we have a case, again, with imprints in the same area that happened a month later. One might argue that if somebody did perform a hoax, they kind of just were perfecting it or doing a repeat, but who knows? He stuck to his story, and it's a case where something happened. Either there was some sort of real craft or somebody created a hoax, because there were real effects.